Hello everybody, the purpose of this short video is to walk you through the steps necessary to connect to your Raspberry Pi for the first time over SSH. Now my Raspberry Pi is plugged into my router via a physical cable. So what we're going to walk through in this video is if your Raspberry Pi is wired directly to your router. There will be another video coming shortly for how to do the same procedure if you're using Wi-Fi on the Raspberry Pi. Okay, so the first thing that we want to recognize here is that the username of the Raspberry Pi by default is Pi, P-I, and the host name of the Raspberry Pi will be Raspberry Pi. So we can do something where we SSH into the username Pi at Raspberry Pi, and we'll get a message like this: the authenticity of host Raspberry Pi cannot be established, blah 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 blah. Are you sure you want to continue connecting? And we're going to say yes. And then we're asked to enter the Raspberry Pi's password. Okay, so the Raspberry Pi password initially will be Raspberry. Okay, so username is Pi, password is Raspberry, and the host name is Raspberry Pi. So now we've successfully SSH'd into our Raspberry Pi. Now, if the previous procedure didn't work due to not being able to locate the host name Raspberry Pi, you may need to log into your router to see what the IP address is that has been assigned to the Raspberry Pi once you plugged it into the router. So I've entered the IP address of my router here, which is 192.168.1.1. You'll have to refer to the documentation that came with your router to see what the IP address is for your particular router. So when I go to this web page, I'm prompted to enter my password for my router. So I'm going to go ahead and enter my password to access my router. Then I'm taken to a page like this, and I can see all the devices that are connected both to my Wi-Fi setup as well as to my LAN. So I'm going to go to this link on the left called Network Map. Now this link might differ on your router, but you want to essentially look for the devices that are connected to your network. So I'm going to click on Network Map. And then I can filter this map by connection type. So whether it's LAN or 2.4 gigahertz or 5 gigahertz. So I'm going to filter by LAN, and I see that I have this new device here, Raspberry Pi. And so if I click on this device, Raspberry Pi, I can get the device info. And in the device info, I see that my IP address is 192.168.1.138. So I want to remember that IP address and write that down. So what we can do now is go back to our terminal, and I'll try to position these in such a way that they're both on the screen. So we can go back to our terminal now, and instead of saying Raspberry Pi or SSH Pi at Raspberry Pi, I can replace the host name Raspberry Pi by this IP address, 192.168.1.138. So now when I hit enter, I'm prompted for the Raspberry Pi's password. Again, it's Raspberry. And now we've SSH'd into the Raspberry Pi using the IP address instead of the host name. So I hope this helps you in connecting to the Raspberry Pi for the first time. At this point, now you can use the terminal to do anything you want to control the Raspberry Pi. I'm going to stop working with it right now. So to exit my session, I can just type in the command exit in the terminal, and that will close the connection to the Raspberry Pi.